Well, good morning, friends. It's great to see all of you. For those of you who might be visiting us this weekend, my name is Father Chris Stanish. I'm the Vicar General for the diocese, and along with Father Jim Wozniak, the pastor here, we just want to offer you a very warm welcome and let you know what a great joy it is to have you with us. So I have to say, as I was praying with the readings for this week, I was particularly drawn to our first reading from Exodus, right? The story about Moses and the burning bush. Now, I have no doubt that that must have been an extraordinary experience, right? Being able to see this plant that is on fire, but not being consumed by the fire. But that's not what I was drawn to. No, in fact, what I was really drawn to was really what God says when he says, listen, I have heard their cry. I have seen their affliction. I have witnessed, I know well the suffering of my people. Right, my friends, I don't know about you, but I'm sure that basically there have been times in your life where you've wondered, where is God? Why isn't he doing something? Why isn't he taking this out of my life? Why isn't he answering my prayer? Why isn't he fill in the blank? Right, and it's good for us to hear these words. Because what he's telling Moses is, I haven't turned a blind eye. I've always been in their midst. I've always been blessing them. Right? And that's important for us to hear. Because we need to hear that this is true. That when we cry out to the Lord, that he's there in our midst. He's already solving things in the background. And when it seems like there isn't an answer, that God is already doing something. Now, I want to provide some context for this passage, right? Because here we have Moses being told to go to Pharaoh and to set God's people free, but how did they get there? Right? We have to remember that the reason why the Hebrew people are in this predicament is because they all had to move into Egypt because of a famine. If you remember, Joseph, right? If you remember Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? Joseph was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, right? They all thought that their father loved him the most, and so really they wanted to kill him, but luckily one of his brothers had mercy on him and decided instead to sell him into slavery to a caravan that was moving to Egypt. And so he gets to Egypt, and he's enslaved, and he has to work in Pharaoh's house, and then he's accused of adultery with Pharaoh's wife, even though he didn't even touch her. So then he's thrown into jail, but then all of a sudden, Pharaoh starts having these dreams, and Joseph is able to interpret the dreams. And so Joseph moves through the ranks, and ultimately, he's in charge of governing over the land on behalf of Pharaoh. Now, this is providential, because famine strikes the land, and people are dying of hunger because there is no food. And so, because of Joseph's circumstances, he's able to save his family. He's able to save the Hebrew people, right? They're able to come to him even though they don't know who he is, and he's able to provide food for them to grow. Right? It's kind of interesting because in the midst of these dire circumstances, all of a sudden we see that God has been blessing them, moving them into that area. And so the people are able to grow, to have children, they become stronger. The problem is that hundreds and hundreds of years, basically Pharaoh forgets who Joseph is. He forgets what Joseph did for the land. And so he sees these Hebrew people growing stronger, and instead of being encouraged, felt threatened by them. I mean, perhaps we know the story, right? I mean, seeing the Prince of Egypt, perhaps we've seen the movie and we think, yeah, this is the story. Right? And that's why Pharaoh enslaves them. And in fact, they're enslaved for 400 years. Right? They're worked to the bone. They're treated terribly. But this is what's so important, is that the entire time we come to find out is that God has heard their cry, that he is in their midst, right? The entire time, God has loved every single one of them. You know, this entire time, he has blessed them in many ways, even if one of those blessings is not yet freeing them from slavery, which might seem really strange to us. But when we think about this, it's so important for us. Because, my friends, we can be in the midst of horrible situations and we can be crying out, Lord, deliver me from this, or free me from this, or take this thing out of my life. And the reality is that there can be times, many times, in fact, when God doesn't release us from that particular situation. When God doesn't free us from that particular thing that's in our life. But that does not mean that he's not blessing us in hundreds of other ways. Right? One of the most important things for all of us to do is to recognize that just because God doesn't answer this particular prayer doesn't mean that he's not answering any prayers. Or just because God hasn't blessed me in this particular way doesn't mean that he's not blessing me in 100 other ways. Right? It's one of the things that the Hebrew people kept in mind. Even as they were in the midst of slavery, right? They knew that God was in their midst. He knew that God was continually with them. They knew that God was continually blessing them and strengthening them, even though they were in an incredibly awful situation. My friends, this is something about the spiritual life, is that God is constantly pouring graces into our lives. The problem is that sometimes our hearts are too small to receive the grace that he wants to give to us. Right? And so sometimes God permits a time of trial or a time of difficulty or something going on in our lives so that our hearts can be purified and strengthened and stretched so that it can be prepared to actually receive whatever that grace is. Right? The image that I would give you is when you're preparing for a party and you want to blow up some balloons, right? You take out the plastic bag and you try to blow up one of the balloons, and some of them are super tiny and other ones are a little bit bigger, but sometimes you're like, what the heck? Why can't I blow up this balloon? And so what do? You stretch the balloon first, and then it's more readily able to receive the air that you blow into it. Right? Our hearts are like that. That God has these big graces for us, and a lot of times we're not ready. And so he stretches our hearts, he prepares our hearts so that he can give us that grace. I mean, this is what he did with the Hebrew people. They weren't yet ready to receive the promised land. But this stretched their hearts. Their time in the desert stretched their hearts so that they could receive it. Sometimes we're overwhelmed or we're anxious and it feels like we're just getting buried. But what if we're actually being planted? Right? That God's actually doing something in our lives that's going to bloom and flourish, and that's what I'm talking about here. So the spiritual challenge that I want to pose to you is that as you go throughout this week, if you find yourself overwhelmed or you find yourself anxious, or perhaps you're going through a trial in your life right now, just to pause, to remember that God is in your midst, that God is continuously blessing you, and to think about all the ways that God is working in your life, preparing your heart so that you might receive whatever grace that he wants to give to you.